14 million people watched Frank Sinatra stand up from the guest chair on live television and tell Johnny Carson the interview was over. Carson didn't call for a commercial. He didn't apologize. He didn't move. He just looked at Sinatra and said 4 words that made Sinatra sit back down. It was March 3rd, 1970. Frank Sinatra was 54 years old and had been the most powerful man in American entertainment for the better part of 2 decades. He had a specific relationship with television that differed from his relationship with every other medium. He used it selectively, appeared on his own terms, and had developed over 15 years a set of expectations about how those appearances would go that every producer, every network, and every host had honored without exception. You did not ambush Frank Sinatra. You did not ask Frank Sinatra questions he hadn't approved. You did not, under any circumstances, make Frank Sinatra feel like he was not in control of the room he was sitting in. Every host before Carson had understood these rules. Most of them had been grateful for Sinatra's appearance under any conditions and had treated the pre-interview approval process as a reasonable cost of having him on. The ratings spike alone was worth the accommodation. Sinatra's people would submit an approved topic list. The host would work from it. The segment would air. Everyone benefited. Carson had agreed to the approved topic list. The list covered 5 areas: his upcoming Las Vegas engagement, the new album he was releasing in April, his film work from the previous year, a general discussion of the state of American music, and his philanthropic work with children's hospitals. It was a generous list. It gave Carson enough material for a 40-minute segment without difficulty. He had reviewed it 3 days before the taping and sent back his confirmation through the standard channels. What the list did not include was any discussion of Sinatra's well-documented and recently renewed romantic life, which had been generating significant press coverage since the previous autumn. The divorce from Mia Farrow had been finalized the previous year after a very public deterioration, and the press had been covering the aftermath with the enthusiasm it reserved for stories that combined fame, beauty, and dissolution in sufficient quantities. Sinatra had said nothing publicly about any of it. His silence on the subject was itself a kind of statement, and his people had made certain, in 2 separate conversations with Carson's producers, that the silence would be maintained on The Tonight Show. The prohibition had been acknowledged and confirmed. Carson had his own notes. He had prepared them over 2 evenings, sitting at the desk in his home office with the research his staff had assembled and the instinct he had developed across 8 years of interviewing people who were more comfortable with some questions than others. He had a sense, the particular sense of a skilled interviewer, that the approved topic list was not where the real interview was, that somewhere adjacent to the approved topics was something Sinatra actually wanted to say, if asked in the right way, by the right person, at the right moment. Carson was not certain, but he had the notes. The first 35 minutes of the segment were everything the approved topic list had promised. Sinatra was in good form, relaxed, funny, generous with his answers in the way he was when he felt the room was his. He talked about Vegas with the authority of someone who had built that city's entertainment culture from the inside. He talked about the new album with the specific technical passion of a musician who still cared deeply about the craft of recording. He told 2 stories about the film work that the audience responded to with the warmth of people watching a master operate in comfortable territory. Carson was a skilled enough interviewer to make 35 minutes of approved material feel like genuine conversation rather than a prepared itinerary. He asked follow-up questions that weren't on the list, but that emerged naturally from Sinatra's answers, kept the energy moving, gave Sinatra room to be interesting. It was good television. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Then Carson paused. He glanced at his note card once, a brief look, the kind that could mean he was checking his next prepared question or could mean something else entirely. He looked back at Sinatra. He smiled the small, specific smile of a man who has made a decision. He asked about Mia Farrow. The name landed in the studio the way a specific kind of silence lands, not empty, but full. Full of the audience's sudden attention, full of the production staff's collective intake of breath, full of Frank Sinatra's expression traveling in approximately 1 second, from the ease of a man in comfortable territory to something considerably less comfortable. Sinatra looked at Carson for a moment. He set down the glass he had been holding. He placed both hands flat on his knees in the gesture of a man organizing himself around a decision. Then he stood up. He was 6 feet tall and had been one of the most physically compelling presences in American entertainment for 30 years. Standing in a television studio while the cameras rolled and 14 million people watched, he occupied the space with the particular authority of someone who had never in his adult life needed to announce that he was the most important person in a room. It was simply visible, the way certain things are visible, without requiring statement. He said, "We're done here, Johnny." He said it at a volume calibrated for Carson and not for the microphone, which meant the studio audience heard it clearly, and the 14 million at home heard it clearly, and everyone in the building heard it clearly. And the specific intimacy of the volume made it more rather than less emphatic. The band didn't play. The director didn't cut to commercial. The studio held its breath. Carson looked up at Sinatra. He had not moved from his position behind the desk. His posture had not changed. His expression had not changed. He had the complete stillness of a man who had anticipated this moment and was entirely at ease within it. He said, "Sit down, Frank." 3 words, the volume of a suggestion, the weight of a statement of fact. The studio was completely silent. Sinatra looked at Carson for a long moment. Several things moved across his face during that moment. Recognition, assessment, something that in a different light might have been the beginning of respect. He was a man who had spent 50 years reading rooms and reading people, and what he was reading in Carson's face was the absence of any of the things he was accustomed to finding when people pushed back against him. Anxiety, performance, calculation. There was nothing there except a man sitting in his chair looking up at him and waiting. Sinatra sat down. The audience exhaled 11 seconds of held breath in the form of applause that lasted longer than anyone in the production booth had anticipated. Carson waited for it to settle. He looked at Sinatra. Sinatra had picked his glass back up and was looking at Carson with an expression the production staff would spend the next several years describing to people who asked about it, an expression that contained in approximately equal measure irritation and something very close to appreciation. Carson said, "You were saying about Mia." Sinatra laughed. It was a short laugh, genuine, the kind that arrives when something has happened that you didn't plan for and are not entirely unhappy about. He said, "You're something else, you know that?" Carson said he'd been told. What followed was 11 minutes of television that no approved topic list had anticipated and that no amount of pre-interview preparation could have produced. Sinatra talked about Pharaoh, not extensively, not in the confessional way that celebrity interviews sometimes deployed as currency, but in the way of a man who had decided, in the specific moment of sitting back down, that the person across the desk had earned a real answer and was going to get one. He talked about what it meant to be that visible, that scrutinized, that consistently reduced by the press to a set of facts that bore only partial resemblance to anything he actually experienced. He talked about the difference between a public life and a private one, and about what happened to that distinction over 30 years when the public life became large enough to consume everything around it. He was not performing vulnerability. He was too controlled for that, and Carson was too good an interviewer to push for it. He was simply talking, accurately and without evasion, about something real. Carson asked 2 follow-up questions in those 11 minutes. Both were specific. Both emerged directly from what Sinatra had just said, and both gave Sinatra exactly what a good follow-up question gives a guest, the sense that the person across the desk had heard what was actually said and not what they expected to hear. Sinatra responded to both with the directness of someone who had decided that this conversation was worth having properly. The audience was completely still for those 11 minutes. Not the performing attention stillness of a studio audience coached to respond at the right moments. The actual stillness of 400 people watching something they had not expected and were not going to look away from. After the taping, in the green room that Sinatra's people had been occupying with increasing agitation for the preceding hour, there was a brief conversation between Sinatra and his manager. The manager appeared to be raising concerns. Sinatra appeared to be indicating that the concerns were noted and that the conversation was over. Sinatra found Carson in the corridor 15 minutes later. He said, "Nobody does that to me." Carson said he understood. Sinatra said, "I'm not finished. Nobody does that to me. And I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between someone who does it to get a reaction and someone who does it because they think it's right." He looked at Carson for a moment. "Which one are you?" Carson said. "The second one." Sinatra nodded once. He said, "Then we're fine." He extended his hand. Carson shook it. Sinatra walked back to his people and Carson walked back to his dressing room, and The Tonight Show went to air that evening with every minute of the segment intact, including the 11 minutes that no approved topic list had authorized and that turned out to be the best 11 minutes of television either man produced that year. The network received calls the following morning. Sinatra's people made their displeasure formally known through 3 separate channels: the talent agency, the personal manager, and a direct call from someone in Sinatra's organization to the NBC president's office. The network asked Carson to respond. Carson sent a 3-sentence reply that the network president read to his staff at the Monday morning meeting and that circulated through the NBC executive floor for the remainder of the week. The 3 sentences were not recorded in any document that survived, but 3 people who heard them gave consistent accounts across separate interviews conducted years later. The first sentence acknowledged that Sinatra's prior conditions had been explicit and that Carson had been aware of them. The second sentence acknowledged that Carson had not honored them. The third sentence explained why, in language that the network president described to a colleague over lunch that same week, as the clearest thing he had heard from a talent in 20 years of running networks. The network did not pursue the matter further. There was, in 1970, no version of a conversation between NBC and Johnny Carson that ended with Carson changing his approach to interviewing. And everyone in the building understood this well enough not to begin one. Sinatra appeared on The Tonight Show 4 more times after March 3, 1970. Every appearance was on Carson's terms: no approved topic lists, no prohibited subjects, no notes delivered to producers during tapings. Sinatra's people made no such requests because Sinatra had not asked them to. What had been established in 90 seconds of live television on a Tuesday night had settled something that didn't need to be relitigated. Each of the 4 subsequent appearances was better television than the approved topic list version would have been. Sinatra was different with Carson than he was with other hosts, more present, more willing to go somewhere real, less interested in the performance of an interview, and more interested in the interview itself. The production staff noticed it. The critics noticed it. Carson never commented on it publicly, because commenting on it would have required explaining what had produced it, and explaining that would have required discussing a moment that both men had tacitly agreed to leave where it was. The last time was 1976. At the end of the segment, Sinatra leaned back in the guest chair and looked at Carson with the expression of a man reviewing a decision he had made 6 years earlier and finding it sound. The segment had been good, easy, substantive, the particular quality that comes when 2 people have established their terms with each other and are operating within them comfortably. He said, "You know what you did that night?" Carson said he had some idea. Sinatra said, "You reminded me what an interview is supposed to be." He paused in the way he paused before lines he meant. "I didn't like it at the time." Carson said he remembered. Sinatra said, "I like it now." He stood up. He shook Carson's hand, a real handshake, the kind that means something rather than the kind that concludes something. He walked off the set. In the years that followed, when television journalists and industry historians wrote about Carson's interviewing style, they identified certain qualities that distinguished him from the hosts who came before and the hosts who came after. The precision, the listening, the specific quality of stillness that made guests feel they were being heard rather than managed. These qualities were real, and they were Carson's own, and they had been developing since long before March 3, 1970. But the people who were in the building that night, who watched a man stand up from the guest chair and heard 3 words bring him back down, who watched 11 minutes of Frank Sinatra say things he had told no interviewer before, those people understood something that the journalism didn't always capture. The stillness wasn't a technique. It wasn't a strategy. It was the posture of someone who knew, with complete certainty, where he was sitting and why, and who understood that nothing Frank Sinatra could say from the guest chair changed any of that. "Sit down, Frank." 3 words, the most important 3 words Carson ever said on television, not because of what they did to Sinatra, because of what they revealed about Carson. If this story reminded you that real respect is sometimes built in the moments when you refuse to give someone less than the truth, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more untold stories about the legends behind the television, and leave a comment about a moment when someone held their ground for the right reason.